Serial killers are one of the most horrific, but at the same time, most intriguing subjects within society. What causes someone to commit some of the most extreme violence imaginable? In this episode, we will examine 10 of the most infamous serial killers hailing from Great Britain. Joanna Dehaney is one of our only modern serial killer entries. She stands out due to being one of the few female serial killers in British history, but also for her attitude towards the killings, something which shocked the nation. Dehaney led a small group consisting of 2 older males, Lloyd and Stretch, that assisted her in carrying out 3 murders in 2013. She specifically targeted men during her killing spree, telling Lloyd that she did not wish to kill a woman, and especially not a woman with children. Lloyd stated Dehaney had wanted to kill 9 men in total, seeking to be like Bonnie and Clyde. Dehaney hunted and stabbed them for the purpose of entertainment, and she told the older of the 2, "I want my fun. I need you to get my fun." She later told a psychiatrist that she had found murder to be Moorish, and that after her first killing, she got a taste for it.
Over the course of 14 days in 2013, Joanne Dennehy murdered 3 men in cold blood and left another 2 fighting for their lives.
Disposing of a body is one of the main factors that leads killers to being caught. Some killers burn the body, some chop it up and spread out the pieces, and some, like John Hay, try to destroy the evidence in acid. Hay became known as the acid bath murderer due to his penchant for disposing of his victims in acid. After spending his early adult years in prison, he came to the realization that he was being caught due to leaving his victims alive. Hay became interested in the crimes of French murderer Georges Seurat, who disposed of victims in sulfuric acid, and while in prison, Hay experimented with dissolving the bodies of field mice. After leaving prison, Hay began a system of befriending the wealthy, murdering them, dissolving their bodies in acid, and trying to convince their families that they had run off. Hay was eventually tried for the murder of 6 individuals, although he later claimed 9 victims, due to a variety of paperwork that simply did not add up. He was found guilty and executed by being hung in 1949. Beverly Eilat worked as a paediatric nurse during the 1990s and carried out her attacks exclusively on children within her care, the oldest victim being an 11-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, and the youngest being only 7 weeks old. 4 children died at Eilat's hands due to being purposely overdosed, and in one case a victim was found with an air bubble within their bloodstream. It took 13 attacks before Eilat's colleagues began to suspect her due to her being the only nurse on duty for all 13 of the attacks. Eilat was found guilty of her crimes and sentenced to 13 consecutive life sentences with a recommended minimum of 30 years to be served. Eilat's motives have never been revealed. One theory suggests that she showed symptoms of Munchausen syndrome, in which someone will purposely abuse someone in their care in order to attract attention to themselves.
Frenzy of attacking and killing, which is unusual for a female serial killer.
Lesley Bailey hit the news in the early 1990s, and the news would shock the world. Bailey was a member of a paedophile group that would kidnap children, take them to a caravan site, drug them, and then force them to take part in orgies that in at least 2 cases resulted in the death of the child. The police investigation was unfruitful, as none of the perpetrators were questioned by the police. It wasn't until Bailey confessed to the murders that he was even on the radar. Bailey was reported to have suffered a childhood of abuse himself, and his IQ was so low he was borderline mentally handicapped. Bailey was sentenced to 2 life sentences, but only served 2 years in prison before being murdered by his fellow inmates inside his cell. During the late 1970s, the county of Yorkshire was under attack by a killer reminiscent of Victorian slayer Jack the Ripper. Dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe preyed on the working girls of Leeds and Bradford, and in one case, a student he mistook for a working girl. Sutcliffe's MO included searching for a prostitute, taking her somewhere remote, striking her over the back of the head with something like a rock or a pipe, and then slashing her with a knife. A few of his victims survived their horrific ordeal, while 13 sadly lost their lives. Sutcliffe was arrested in 1981 after being stopped by police due to having false plates on his car. A prostitute was in the car alongside him, undoubtedly on the way to her death. During his trial, Sutcliffe claimed that the voice of God spoke to him and told him to cleanse the world of prostitutes. He pleaded not guilty on grounds of insanity, but despite being diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, he was sentenced to 20 consecutive life sentences.
Peter Sutcliffe admitted to being the Yorkshire Ripper, and in a 15-hour statement gave the police a full confession.
10 Rillington Place was the hunting ground of John Christie. Christie had a normal upbringing, excelling at school, but due to his quiet demeanour, he was often bullied. To make matters worse, he also suffered from impotence and could only really perform with prostitutes, something that was lorded over him throughout his life and bound to have had severe psychological impact. After moving to 10 Rillington Place, due to a new position as a police officer, Christie began his 12-year murderous rampage. Christie's first murder was of a young Austrian prostitute who he brought home while his wife was away and proceeded to strangle to death after having sex with her. The most notable murder he committed led to the death of Beryl and Geraldine Evans, and as a result, Beryl's husband Timothy also lost his life. The Evans lived in the same building as Christie and had interacted with each other over the years since the Evans moved in. Towards the end of 1949, Timothy Evans reported his wife and daughter missing, claiming that John Christie was the murderer, having killed his wife after a failed abortion. Unfortunately, police procedure was very unregulated at the time, and the police decided Timothy was the real killer, forcing him to confess to the murder. It was later revealed that Timothy Evans suffered from a very low IQ. Timothy Evans was hung for the murder of his wife a year later, while John Christie remained in 10 Rillington Place. Christie carried on a number of murders in the 3 years following Evans' death, including that of his wife Ethel Christie. Christie decided to move from 10 Rillington Place in 1953, which meant that his landlord began to show potential new tenants around the flat. Many complained of an unpleasant odour, which led to the search and eventual discovery of 13 bodies around the home and grounds. Christie was arrested while using a false identity later that year and was quickly tried and executed for his grisly crimes. Timothy Evans was later acquitted of the murder of his wife and daughter. Dennis Nilsen became known as the British Jeffrey Dahmer as he carried out a number of killings between 1978 and 1983, leaving a body count of 12 men. Nilsen was born in Scotland shortly following the end of World War II. Nilsen's father was a Norwegian soldier who fathered Nilsen and his two siblings on his brief trips to Scotland. The marriage failed by the time Nilsen was 3, and he was raised fatherless. Nilsen himself joined the military when he became of age and was deployed to a number of different countries, notably to Yemen. During his deployment, he would experience having his own room for the first time in his life, which would lead to the discovery of his homosexuality and of several kinks involving unwilling partners and incorporating the dead bodies he'd seen. After 11 years in the military, Nilsen moved to London to take up a position as a police officer and at the same time began his career of carnage as he struck London with fear. The majority of Nilsen's victims were homeless or homosexual men. He met his victims in bars, on public transport, or on one occasion outside his own home. All of Nilsen's murders were committed inside the same home in North London, as Nilsen lured his victims inside with sex or alcohol. Once inside, his victims were strangled to unconsciousness or death. Those that survived the initial strangulation would then be subject to drowning. Nilsen would then bathe, clothe, and groom the bodies of his victims before keeping them in his home for months at a time, before finally dismembering the corpses. Finally, the victims would be burnt on a bonfire in the back garden. Nilsen was sentenced to a life with a minimum of at least 25 years. As of 2018, Nilsen remains safely behind bars. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, known collectively as the Moors murderers, were a murderous couple that preyed on young children, assaulted them, and tortured them before murdering them in the wildlands of the Yorkshire Moors. Ian Brady decided to kill to prove that he could commit the perfect murder, to prove that he was smarter than everyone else and would not get caught. Brady and Hindley planned their murders. They would patrol the streets looking for a victim. Hindley would stop the van and ask the victim if they could help her or wanted a lift, and unfortunately, the victims would trust the female and enter the van. They would then be taken to the middle of nowhere on the Yorkshire Moors, under the guise of helping Hindley find something, often a glove. Brady would turn up on his motorbike and be introduced as Hindley's boyfriend. While searching for the object, the two would turn on the victim, torture them, sexually assault them before killing them and burying them, some to never be found. Brady became more confident as the killings progressed and eventually tried to recruit Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith. Smith was present for but unaware of the final murder of the Moors murderers. He was to be their downfall as he reported the crime to the police, which saw both sentenced to a life behind bars. The Wests were a murderous couple that acted throughout the 1970s and 80s to kill a large number of single women that entered their house. Some were hired help, some were brought in for sexual reasons, and 2 were children of the couple. Fred West was a murderer before he even met Rose. After divorcing his first wife, He would impregnate an 18-year-old named Anne McFall. At 8 months of pregnancy, she was brutally stabbed to death following an argument and had parts of her body and even her unborn child cut out from her to be kept as keepsakes. While living with his new wife Rose West, Fred was sentenced to jail, leading Rose to look after their own young children, as well as Fred's from his previous marriage. During his prison sentence, Rose would routinely torture 8-year-old Charmaine and murdered her before Fred was released from prison. Shortly after this murder, Rena Costello, Fred's first wife, turned up to find out the whereabouts of her daughter. She was strangled to death and mutilated extensively to stop people asking questions about Charmaine. Over the following 20 years, the West would begin to kill for fun and sexual pleasure. They would kill 12 people in total, including another of their children, in 16-year-old Heather West, who was to be their final victim. Following their arrest after the inquest, Heather's disappearance led to the discovery of bodies littering the West property. All 4 remaining children were placed into care. The West were jailed and given a life sentence with no chance of seeing freedom. Fred West managed to hang himself within a year of being in jail, while Rose West remains behind bars to this day. Dr. Death, also known as Harold Shipman, currently holds the title for the most confirmed kills by a serial killer in recorded history at 218 deaths. The mild-looking doctor from England sure doesn't seem to fit the stereotype of a killer capable of killing hundreds, proving that you could never judge a book by its cover. Shipman had a normal upbringing, excelling in school and eventually qualifying as a doctor. Early in his career he was caught forging prescriptions and charged £600 in fines. Incredulously, Shipman managed to found his own practice in another city just a few years later. It was at this surgery that Dr. Death would prey on his fellow man. An inquiry was brought against Shipman after several family members felt uneasy after the deaths of their elderly residents. Unfortunately, due to inexperienced officers being assigned to the case, Shipman was able to carry on his killing for years. Shipman was convincing his patients to change their wills to include him before increasing their prescriptions to dangerous levels, resulting in the death of many. In August 1988, a taxi driver named John Shaw, who became concerned at the death of many of his elderly patients that he was driving to Shipman's practice, contacted the police, informing them that he suspected Shipman of murdering 21 of his patients. One of the victim's daughters, a lawyer named Angela Woodruff, became concerned when solicitor Brian Burgess informed her that a will had been made, apparently by her mother. There were doubts about its authenticity. The will excluded her and her children, but left £386,000 to Shipman. An investigation found Shipman guilty of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. Shipman was found dead in his cell by hanging on his 58th birthday. The prison came under heavy criticism from the media for allowing the suicide to happen.
And even after the report came out, there were still families who just didn't believe what they were hearing.